Hey, good afternoon, everyone, in American History 1. I am covering Chapter 9, Democracy in America. Important chapter, very significantly focuses on Andrew Jackson's time, but there's other things that obviously surround American history. So one of the things I find fascinating about history is the sources of information. Where do they come from? What's important? What do we study? What do we know? And what do we not record and study? And sometimes we think of it as the lens of which we look through history. Obviously, history is different for people that are in charge, different for people that are of the wealthy class, different for people that are poor, different for people that are of a certain religion or another, different whether you're a male or a female, different whether you're a child or an elderly person. These perspectives in history really change the dynamic. And one thing I do like about this book, I think it gives a well-rounded view of the milestones that are important to understand in our historical backdrop. But anyways, chapter 9 is a big one, Democracy in America. Why is that the title? Because democracy changes significantly during this period of time once we get to the election of Andrew Jackson. But prior to that, um, we have to talk about what democracy is. And some of you are in my political science class, and you know that pure democracy was despised by the founders. They thought it was horrific. They equated it with a tyranny of mob rule. And so the form of democracy they wanted was a representative democracy. And the representatives that would be chosen by society's upper crust, the elite, those that had a vested interest, landowners, property owners, taxpayers, those were the ones that were going to participate in picking the representatives, and they would likely pick what kind of representatives? The educated, the vested, the ones that had a great track record of civic responsibility. We're going to break away from that now. We become much more democratized. It started with Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson believed that all white males, adult males, whether they were property owners or not, should participate in the democratic process, not only for voting, but also for sitting for office. It started with him. And Andrew Jackson later is going to say he is basically the continuation of Jeffersonian democracy. It's actually going to start the Democratic Party. They were called the uh, Democratic Republicans or the Republican Democratic Party under Jefferson, but now they become just called the Democrats at this later point. But prior to that, we have to remember we don't like pure democracy. And are we getting closer to it now? Yeah. So a lot of the more conservative members, I don't know if I should use the word conservative, but more traditional members of what the framers saw as a representative democracy were stunned by this growing ability to participate in civic life, and they didn't like it. And there's still that argument to this day. I think, should my 20-year-old son have the same exact power to participate both in terms of running for office? I would hope I'd get more votes than him if I was running for office. That requires a certain degree of skill and education. Not that any are required. Usually there's no threshold for that. But in terms of being vested, working and paying taxes, although he works, he doesn't pay nearly as much in taxes as I do, but I am much more educated than he is. His vote is just as equal as mine. That's democracy. And so you can see the argument of like how pure democracy tends to make some people shiver with fear and wants to have a more of a hybrid system where we choose the more sometimes older. We even put it in the Constitution. You can't be too young to run for the U.S. Congress. You have to be minimum 25 for the House of Representatives, and you have to be 30 to run for Senate. To be president, you have to be 35. Why they put that in there? It's a buffer. We don't want pure democracy in some things. And then the ability to even pick your president is buffered by the Electoral College. But anyways, I'm getting a little off track. So democracy in the early republic, we know it starts to evolve under Thomas Jefferson, and the attitudes start to change. And Alexander Hamilton, I said it pretty well. What did he say? He said some kind of thing. I thought I underlined his quote. The elite leaders of political parties could not afford to overlook the cultivation of popular favor. He even started recognizing the populace having power in politics now, and it wasn't only up to the chosen few. And this created a tension with some of the old timers, if you will, that helped form the nation of our country. So our nation does evolve, whether good or bad, but it's more democratic, especially now, than it ever has been. But certainly in this era, it starts to change. Then the book shifts and starts talking about the Missouri Compromise of 1819. What is the Missouri Compromise? Well, we got all these new Western lands as a result of the purchase of the Louisiana Purchase, 1803. We pretty much are going to become the continent that we think of that we are now in terms of capturing that midsection of North America from coast to coast. But Missouri is the next one that petitions for statehood. And what's the big concern? We're more in this view, that's not just over slavery, but slavery is the vehicle. We're talking about sectional conflicts, north and south, east and south. Actually, there's three regions. There's the western political sort of sect, and they ebb and flow. Sometimes they side with northeastern views. Sometimes they side with southern views. And then there's the south, right? The south, northeast, and the west. These are the three sort of political sectionalized sections of the country. The west is the flipping of the coin. The south and the northeast have differing views over economic, societal, and the question of slavery. And so the Missouri Compromise is part of the Missouri crisis. And I'm glad the book called it a crisis, because it was. Missouri wants to come into the state, and right away, the North is upset that it becomes a slave state. The South not only gets another state where slavery is going to expand, and many Northerners were abolitionists. They wanted slavery to end. They saw it abhorrent. Others were concerned about expanding slavery, not so much because of the concept of slavery, but if it becomes a slave state, their philosophical outlook will be more unified with Southern interest, therefore creating a stronger Southern bloc in the Congress and in presidential elections and electoral college. So it's really a two-tiered worry here how that state and territory is going to come in. And so the first argument, there's the Wilmot Proviso, that was with Texas, but now we have one similar to that. It's called the Talmadge Amendment. The Talmadge Amendment says, yeah, Missouri, you can come in as long as, and here's what it was. It wasn't just pure ending of slavery or banning of slavery. Missouri can come in with slaves, but here's what it is. Talmadge claimed that the institution of slavery mocked the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal. You got to stop slavery. He proposed that Congress should admit Missouri as a state only if it brings in more slaves to Missouri were prohibited. No more slaves that are there already, right? That's it. And the children born to the current slaves would become freed at 25. So a gradual emancipation of slaves that are currently there. Talmadge probably knew, and many of the Northern abolitionists probably knew this wasn't going to fly, but they knew they'd probably get the bill to go through at least the House of Representatives, which was dominated by the Northeast, but they knew the Senate would shoot it down and probably the president would veto it anyways. But it's one of those things. Sometimes you don't always think the law is going to pass, but you want it out there in the public realm. That created a lot more tension. So the Talmadge Amendment gets shot down, but it does create bitter rivalry now between the North and the South over this question of how we can expand westwardly, whether it's slave or non-slave. Thomas Jefferson's even mentioned in the book, how was he, 70? Yeah, he's 77 years old during the Missouri crisis of 1819, and he said that the momentous question, like a fire bell in the night, awakened and filled me with terror over the huge bitterness of the question of slavery. He couldn't believe it was that important to American people. Well, it was sectional strife as well that was important. So what are we going to do? We're a crisis. Missouri wants to come into the state. Talmadge Amendment gets shot down. So how are we going to do it? And that's, unfortunately, sometimes it's called the Missouri Compromise, but that's usually the one of 1850. They're both about Missouri or related to Missouri. But the Missouri Compromise of 1819 was that Missouri could come in as a slave state. And we're going to create an artificial boundary of the latitude of 36 degrees 30. I don't know what the second it says feet, but a linear line, basically the latitudinal lines around the earth, which is the southern border of Missouri. Anything south of that, future expansions in the western territories would be slave. Anything north of that would be non-slave. Well, that's part of the compromise. The other compromise is Missouri comes in as a slave state. Now the Southerners are happy. Got more Southern senators. We got more Southern Congress members. North isn't going to have that. So what they did was they will let Maine come in. Maine was then a Massachusetts territory. Maine will be allowed in the state as a free state. So therefore, Missouri is going to get 2 senators that are slave state senators, and we're going to get 2 senators from Maine that are free state senators. And the tension's that strong. So the 3 things that come out of that: Missouri slave state. Second, Maine would come in as a free state. And third, the southern border of Missouri would mark the new boundary between slave states and free states. That's going to work for a period of time until we get to the crisis in 1850, and that's the second compromise that comes out, which is very similar in nature to this compromise, but it's the Civil War is brewing already. I mean, the tension's palpable, and Henry Clay keeps the peace. He's the great negotiator, and he's the one that, it wasn't just him, but he gets the headlines of avoiding the war over the Missouri Compromise of 1819. Now the rise of Andrew Jackson. We know his story earlier. He fought Native Americans in different battles throughout his time. He goes back to Tennessee. He's a slave owner. I think he owns 150 slaves at one point. He's a commoner. He fought with the British at the age of like 12. I mean, I don't know how much he really fought, but he actually got beaten severely by a British officer. I think he had a scar on his face as a result. And I think his father and brother were killed in the Revolutionary War. He hates the British. But he's also a real, he's one of those guys that at moments I'm like, I want to be like Andrew Jackson. Then at moments I'm like, oh my God, I hope I'm never affiliated with Andrew Jackson. What's his negatives? Well, obviously owning slaves will always be a negative, but it was also his treatment of Native Americans as a big factor, and also his ignoring of the Supreme Court's opinion. The rule of law wasn't nearly as important as the rule of Andrew Jackson. It's a bit of a power-hungry guy. He did it for the best interest in the country, as how he saw it, but he gets nicknamed King Andrew as a result of his strength in office. But we'll get to that in a second. What's his early career? So he's a farmer in Tennessee. He has kind of some success, but he's very successful as an attorney. Self-taught back in that area. He didn't go to law school and all these prestigious colleges and so on. He just worked under the apprenticeship system for a period of time as an attorney. He's a pretty bright guy. He does very, very well as an attorney. He's a member of the House of Representatives for a period of time. He's a senator for a period of time, but he has to leave office because he said of economic reasons. I guess they didn't pay that well back then. But because of his political position, he's pretty popular. He managed to get himself a commission as a general during the War of 1812, and we know the story. He fights he's involved in some things, but then he's down in New Orleans, and he fights the Battle of New Orleans against the British, even though the war is over, but we don't know it's over because the Treaty of Kent has been signed over in Europe, but the way communication was happening in 1814 into 1850, very, very slow. And so he fights this great battle for a war that was already over, but he becomes a hero. Very few Americans died in that Battle of New Orleans, but significant amounts of British soldiers were killed or wounded. And he becomes a real hero, and he's very popular with his troops, even though he's a very strict disciplinarian. He's loved by his troops, gets the name Old Hickory because he's so tough, and he is a tough guy. Not only is he tough, I mean, the book even alludes to it. I usually don't like to talk about what I consider to be some of the more trivial questions of history, but this guy was involved in a lot of duels. He was shot in a duel. He survived. He killed people in duels. He often fought over honor. He was known to be a bit of a hothead in terms of anger. One of my favorite stories was he was having a cabinet meeting and he really chewed everybody out, and everyone left like literally scared, like physically scared. Was he going to thrash me with a cane or something when he left? And everyone was like, oh my God, am I going to be fired? Or am I going to, is he going to challenge me to a duel? And after everyone left, one of his closest aides, he kind of laughed and goes, they all thought I was serious, But that was his outward thing. He was a tough dude. You didn't want to mess with Andrew Jackson. But anyway, so Andrew Jackson, because of the War of 1812 and his participation as a military leader, and we have a long history of this, we tend to really honor our military veterans, and rightly so, and he becomes very, very popular. He's not done, though, with battles. He also fights the Seminole Indians, and he actually enters into on very vague orders. I know I put that in a little quiz. Very vague orders about dealing with the Seminole Indians in Florida. He invades Florida and he kills a bunch of former slaves that were working in a British fort down in Florida. And he kills actually two British, I don't know if they're officers or officials, executes them. And he executes a bunch of African-American slaves that were down in Florida as free citizens of that territory. 270 former slaves, executing some of the survivors. It was called a Negro fort at the time. This is in 1860. He did in 1818. He went back again. He arrested two British subjects. He had them executed for helping the Seminoles. And a lot of people said, hey, we got to fire Andrew Jackson. He's a general that's out of control. But President Monroe saw him as a kind of an asset, because as a result of that, we basically got Florida as a result of basically Andrew Jackson having kind of a, we'll call him a renegade, but he was taking power into his own hands. He invaded Florida as a result of that. We bought it from Spain on a huge, I think it was $5 million, some ridiculously low amount of money. And that's the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1890, which gave Florida to the United States. And the reason why they call it Adams, John Quincy Adams at the time was the Secretary of State. So anyways, now he's a presidential candidate. He wants to run for president. He does in 1824, and he doesn't get whipped. He wins the popular vote. But there's other candidates involved, all three from different sections of the country. Surprise, surprise. John Quincy Adams from the Northeast, Henry Clay from the West. Tennessee, I guess, is the midline quasi, I don't know, southern border state, and that's Andrew Jackson. And the fourth character, I never can remember his name. Yeah, William Crawford from Georgia, clearly deep south, right? So now you got the four regional areas. Andrew Jackson wins the popular vote, so he's going to be president, right? No, we don't have a system like that. You got to hit that. Now, it wasn't 270 back then, what the Electoral College was. It was based upon the number of representatives, just like it is today, number of senators, so we had so many states. But he couldn't get the Electoral College majority that he needed at the time. And so, like that election, just like in 1800 with Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, it goes to the House of Representatives. I don't know, if I was in the House of Representatives, I'd say, well, who won the popular vote? That seems like what America wants. Let's do that. But they didn't in that era. Henry Clay makes a bargain with John Quincy Adams, says, hey, make me your Secretary of State, and I'll throw my votes behind you. And that's what they did. Boy, was Andrew Jackson upset. Andrew Jackson called the corrupt bargain between Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams, and he seethed over it for the next 4 years. And he would run again, and John Quincy Adams, brilliant man, but not a great politician. He alienates a lot of people, and Andrew Jackson's popularity continues to grow, and he sweeps to victory fairly easily in 1828. He wins his first time in the presidential election in 1828. Interesting stuff. I think it is anyways. During the election, Andrew Jackson gets a lot of criticism over his wife, who didn't quite have a divorce yet done with her ex-husband. She gets ridiculed. She's a little bit younger than Andrew Jackson too. Not that that would be a big deal that era, but whether or not you're married to somebody else would be. And Andrew Jackson was so upset over his wife being maligned by John Quincy Adams' campaign people, and maybe himself too, that he was so bitter. And now the bitterness increases because shortly after the election was over, she perishes. I don't know what the health malady was during that period of time, but Andrew Jackson felt that was because of the campaign and the negative press that she got in the campaign that ultimately killed her. So he'll never forget John Quincy Adams for that. And, in fact, another thing comes up a little bit later. But here's the thing: testable thing besides him becoming the president. His first election goes to the House of Representatives because it's not a clear majority in the Electoral College. But he wins in 1828. He's the president. What happens right after that? There was a very high tariff put on certain goods and products, and it was really impacting the South. The North kind of liked it. Again, it's regional. The North likes this tariff. South hates it. It's killing them. It's crushing, especially South Carolina. South Carolina, the former vice president, remember him? John C. Calhoun, right? John C. Calhoun is actually the vice president under Andrew Jackson. Both are state rights guys. And John C. Calhoun thinks that Andrew Jackson is going to side with South Carolina and basically do away with the tariff. But he said, tariffs are a lawfully passed thing. We're going to enforce it. John Tyler ultimately leaves the cabinet over this question, and he goes back to the U.S. Senate. But when he's down there, he writes something called the Great Exposition, basically a protest. And he said, states have the power to nullify federal law if it interferes with their vision of what the Constitution allows, and if it interferes with the state's sovereignty and their state's interest. It was basically a rehashing, in my opinion, very eloquently written. If you ever actually read the exposition by John C. Calhoun, it basically argues nullification. It's the same thing as the Kentucky and Virginia resolves that Thomas Jefferson and James Madison wrote under the Alien and Sedition Act, arguing that Kentucky and Virginia had a right to ignore the Alien and Sedition Act as unconstitutional because we are a union of states, we voluntarily join, and we have just as much power to voluntarily walk away. So prior to the Civil War of 1860, we almost have a civil war over the nullification crisis in South Carolina. What's it over? The Great Tariff. In South Carolina, they called it the Tariff of Abominations. And so the state of South Carolina starts getting their militia ready for war. We're anybody that tries to enforce this federal tariff will be arrested, will be charged, will be expelled from the state. And Andrew Jackson, although a very big state rights guy, small federal government guy, was still a big believer in federal supremacy when the federal government did have authority, and here it did. And he said, you know what, we're going to have federal troops go down, and we're going to crush South Carolina's argument of sovereignty under this nullification crisis. What happens? A stitch in time, it saves this nation, and they reduce. Actually, Andrew Jackson got passed something called the Force Act, where they were going to be allowed to go down, and he was already had authority to have troops go into South Carolina and crush the potential rebellion. No shots were fired. Nothing ever came to that, but it was close. It was a close call. They reduced the tariffs of abomination down to a tariff that South Carolinians thought was much more palpable and acceptable, and the crisis was averted. But this undercurrent of states' rights versus federal power, we always think it's over slavery, but it's more than that. It's over states' rights as well. Slavery becomes definitely the vehicle in 1860, but we see the undercurrents between sectional rights, sectional interest, and states' rights versus federal authority is still brewing in this country. It didn't get resolved at the Constitutional Convention of 1787. I like this in the book. It's kind of I don't know if it's trivial, but it's kind of interesting. The Eaton affair, it comes up next. The Secretary of War, I believe? Secretary of War, sometimes called the petticoat affair. Petticoats are the undergarment of women back in the era under their dresses, like a slip, I guess it is. It is also, Calhoun resigns as a result of this, but it's also because of the nullification crisis as a vice president. But his, I believe it's, John Henry Eaton is a senator from Tennessee whom Jackson nominated to be Secretary of War. He gets in. Well, just a few months earlier, he had married this woman named Margaret O'Neill Timberlake, whose husband, a Navy officer, had just recently killed himself. And there's the theory that Eaton probably was maybe having an affair with this young lady named Margaret O'Neill Timberlake. They put a photograph of her. She's much older. Sure, still beautiful then, but probably looked a lot different when she was in her younger years. And there was an uproar over it. And what else did she do? She had a boarding house. And in her boarding house, there was not only did they have so there's this affair, committed suicide, but Eaton's boarding house might have been a house of ill repute, was part of the rumor. Well, the other women, John C. Calhoun's wife, the other wives of the other administrators would shun her. And so any event that she was at, the wives wouldn't go. We're not going. And basically they told their husbands, you better not go either, or if you go, you're not staying long. They did that much influence that Andrew Jackson was so upset over it, saying because his wife was she's dead now, but he didn't like the fact that Eaton's wife is being treated with this sort of rumor mill, gossipy kind of stuff. He gets outraged because he knows how his wife suffered from it. He calls everybody into a cabinet meeting, basically saying, hey, you guys all going to, stop this rumor mongering. And they said, no. Basically, no, she's kind of a woman of ill repute. We're not going to reckon. Our wives are up in arms and they are boycotting anything that she's involved in. And so they all resign. Almost all of them resign. His cabinet basically gets dismissed, including Eaton. Eaton resigns too because his wife's part of the catalyst of this whole problem. He has to start all over. He won't tolerate it. Fascinating to me. Before I get deeper into that, I want to talk about, I guess we can do it with the bank war. Thing I like about Jackson is he believes in the common man. I wish he believed in all of the common men and all of the common women, but he believes in the common man, which at least in this era is refreshing. No property interest, doesn't matter. You're just as good as the educated. He didn't like titles. He didn't like having an office in government that was permanent. Everyone should be able to participate in seeking office and holding it and being appointed for a period of time. No career politicians. He was an anti-career politician, but he was also for the common men. Don't forget, the government of 1828 wasn't nearly as significant as it is today. He was not a fan of experts, not a fan of titled people. He hated the aristocracy because he hated Great Britain, which was a monarchy. He was the real champion of common people. That part of him I really loved. And because of that, he was also even though he had his own wealth, but it was self-made, he really disliked wealthy people. He was really he was a class ally of the common person. And the Bank of the United States, which is a federal charter, but owned predominantly, the federal government owns part of it, but most of it's owned by rich investors. And it makes a huge profit. It doesn't go to the people, it goes to these investors. Andrew Jackson hated it. And so they tried to bring up a renewal of the charter early. The charter's still good. Andrew Jackson vetoes the early renewal of the bank. But the bank still exists because the old charter is still going to be good for, I don't know, like 8, 9, 10 years, whatever. Andrew Jackson hates it so much that he criticizes it publicly, and he's quoted as saying, "The bank is trying to kill me, but I will kill it." And he did. He killed it by removing, because he had the power to do so with the Treasury, he took all the money out and put it in the state banks. He hated the federal bank. Unfortunately, it was kind of noble in the sense that, get away from all these rich people making money off the American taxpayer. That part I like, but the problem is it created, the federal bank system did create a lot of stability in our currency and in our economic system, and it really created a huge problem later on down the road. We had in 1837 we had a huge panic, and part of it was because of the lack of a federal banking system, because he wouldn't renew the charter. But Andrew Jackson's war with the national bank, still to this day, kind of every so often, get rid of this national bank crap, because it's really not a national bank of the government. It's a national bank that the government gives permission to these very wealthy investors, many of them were foreign, to run national currency policy. It's an interesting dynamic. So sometimes I love Andrew Jackson, sometimes I hate, but he serves 2 very strong terms. Again, it's still not, he could have ran for a third. He's getting pretty old. In fact, he was so weak near the end of his presidency that he looked very, very frail, but mentally he was very, very sharp right up until the end. Martin Van Buren's his chosen sort of successor, because Andrew Jackson's power. Van Buren gets in for another term, and that's when the panic of 1837 happens. Banks basically go belly up left and right. They're very, very much unregulated. They're giving risky loans out, and there's a huge real estate bubble in the West. Land that was going for $10 an acre suddenly drops down in value to $3 or $4 an acre, and the economy comes to a grinding halt. Manufacturers slow down, the economy slows down. There's really depression. And it lasts for about 4 or 5 years. And it was a really difficult time in American history in terms of the economy. Huge boom, though. And I'm not saying, it's not like we go into a depression where we have people becoming homeless and things like that, but money becomes scarce during this period of time. And it's like there's an example here of where there was somebody writing, a British diplomat wrote back to the home country in 1842. It says, "America presents a lamentable appearance of exhaustion and demoralization." That's any kind of economic depression would do that to anybody. But a part of it was because of, it's almost like Thomas Jefferson's embargo. It's like, it sounds great, and a lot of people were in favor of it until they saw the economic ramifications of it. It was really not that that was the only reason for the boom and bust era of 1837 into the 1840s, but part of it is the fact that he killed the national bank. It comes back. The rise of the Whigs. I hate the name of the party of the Whigs, just like I hate the name of the Know-Nothings. And who were the Know-Nothings? You should know them. Didn't talk about it that much in this test because we don't talk too much about the immigration. I thought we did in this chapter. Maybe I did in the last chapter. They run together. But immigration becomes so unpopular during this period. The Know-Nothings, which is a nativist group that say, we're a Protestant Anglo-America. These Irish, especially the Catholics, we don't want them. We don't need them. Get them out of here. And they were very, very racist and biased, bigoted party. There's no question about it. But this other party's name, I think, is worse than the Know Nothings. And why they call them the Know Nothings? They were a secret society, basically. And if any, you were always told, if anybody asked you about the party that you're in, they were called the American Party later. They said, I don't know anything about it. We know nothing. And they thought it was better to be secret. So the rise of the Whigs. The Whig Party is based upon the anti-monarchy aristocratic parties in Great Britain. They were called the Whigs over there. They wore wigs in the Parliament. They were anti-monarchy. They were anti-aristocracy. And because Andrew Jackson wielded so much power, he was viewed as King Andrew. And the party basically stood for one thing: to be anti-democratic party, to be anti-Andrew Jackson. And they had some success. They got 3 presidents elected. They got members of the House, but their whole party platform was being anti-democratic and anti-Andrew Jackson stances. And the first candidate they get elected, a little bit backfires. It's Henry Harrison. He's a war hero. He's also raised in a log cabin. That's why they call it the log cabin campaign. He's a person of the people. They figured that's going to counter the Andrew Jackson motif, if you will. They got a war hero, a patriot, and they pick as a running mate a states' rights guy, Andrew Taylor, or John Taylor. Is it John? I always get confused. What I liked about Taylor was it backfires completely. Yeah, John Taylor, vice president, he's from Virginia. He's a slave owner. He becomes much more like Andrew Jackson than the Whigs wanted. But the reason why I'm saying this is Henry Harrison comes in, and the poor problem with Henry Harrison, he gives the longest inauguration speech in the history. William Henry Harrison does. And the theory is he catches a cold, gets very, very sick, and dies. I mean, how many days later he dies? 2-hour inauguration has 31 days later, he dies as a result of this, I don't know, plague or whatever he's got, serious flu. He gets sick and dies. John Taylor comes in, and he's very much like Andrew he's not a nationalist, very much states' rights, very much let Congress run the country, and it really backfires on the Whigs. So, in fact, they called it, instead of his presidency, they called it his accidency. Unpopular with the Whigs of his own party. In fact, he ends up running, I think, as a different party member later on. Anti-Mason. Oh, here it is. Anti-Masons, anti-immigrants, and anti-Whigs. The Mason group has been around for a long time. I think George Washington was even a member of the Masons. They're a secret society. They believe in Enlightenment principles. I know you have to believe in a higher authority, some kind of godly. You can't be an atheist, for lack of a better way of saying it. But their thing is about Enlightenment theory, that reason should rule the day. And it's usually educated members of society become members of the Masons. They're no longer real Masons. Like, I don't know how to put stones on top of other stones to create a masonry wall. It's more just a society they kept the name from over in Europe, recognizing sort of civic life and responsibility. And it was usually wealthy, educated men, white men, that joined the Masonries. But because they were secret, they became very much viewed skeptically as almost part of a conspiracy behind to rule the country with secret symbols and concepts. Those things are still talked about to this day. And anybody that was named a Mason or known as a Mason was often thought of as being anti-patriotic and part of a subversive secret society that was developing in this era as well. Yeah, look at some of the members: George Washington, Ben Franklin, Andrew Jackson, Henry Clay. They were all members of the Masons. I know Harry Truman was as well. So these religious reformers at the time thought Masonry was anti-Christian, was anti-religion, and there was a big pushback against them. And along with the anti-Masonic movement was also the anti-Catholic movement, and Catholics were part of the new immigrant movement as well. So when you're anti-Catholic, you're really anti-immigrant was the view. They thought of as Catholicism as being this mysterious, superstitious religion run by a pope in a foreign country. And John Kennedy had to deal with that when he ran for president, because everyone says, well, is he going to be the president of the people, or is he going to answer to the pope? There was fears of that, and people that viewed Catholicism that way. Protestants and Catholicism, well, they were one faith at one time, but the breaking away from it with Martin Luther back in the day really created a divide even to much later time. Poor Irish Catholics were viewed as inferior, incorruptible, and immoral. And that group, the Know Nothing Party, really ran on a campaign of anti-immigrant. Do we have those things happen today? Maybe not against the Irish, but do we have nativist groups that fear new people who are different than us based upon religion and ethnicity? Sure, it's a recurring theme in history. In summer of 1834, a mob of Protestants attacked a Catholic convent near Boston. Interesting history here. We know later that part of Joe Kennedy, the family patriarch of John F. Kennedy, his father, and his father's father, P.J. Kennedy, Patrick Kennedy. These guys were Irish immigrants that often were viewed with very, very much disdain by the sort of Mayflower Brahmins of the Boston era. And that tension was what Joe Kennedy fought about, why he really arguably fought to become very wealthy and powerful politically and economically, was to show that he had a place in this country as well against those Brahmin Protestant, well-established Mayflower sect of the Boston area. That tension arguably still is there to some degree on some level, but it's interesting when John F. Kennedy ran for U.S. Senate against Henry Cabot Lodge. That was the argument. It was the Irish Catholic up-and-comers trying to fight the old establishment of the Mayflower, aristocracy of Massachusetts. Very interesting. Race during the Jackson democracy didn't trickle down to blacks at all, didn't trickle down to Native Americans at all. In fact, Native Americans to this day see Andrew Jackson as being sort of a pariah and an evil person. In fact, I remember Donald Trump was giving some awards to some Native Americans under the portrait of Andrew Jackson. I don't know if he didn't know, but it was considered to be very offensive to the Native Americans because Andrew Jackson's responsible for allowing the state of Georgia to basically remove the Cherokee Nation from their sovereign lands in Georgia. But he also fought major battles against the Seminole Indians and also the Creeks. I mean, he was for lack of a better way, back in the era, they called him an Indian fighter. And that's how he got part of his pedigree as a warrior. So blacks did not do well in the South at all. They're slaves. In the North, there was some progression, but man, it wasn't that big. They still weren't allowed to participate and run for government. They often weren't allowed to sit on juries. There was still a lot of racism, and I thought what Story gave a lot of clarity to that was this gentleman who became a guy in Pennsylvania. The Constitution of Pennsylvania disenfranchised one of the richest people in Philadelphia, a guy named James Fortin, a free-born sailmaker of African descent. And he served in the American Revolution and become very, very wealthy as a merchant. He used his wealth and influence to promote the abolition of slavery. And after the 1838 Constitution, he tried to take a lawsuit to seek his right to vote. And what did they? I love the quote here. Said he was white enough to be taxed, but not white enough to vote. And that's very, very sad. Part of our history. We often think the Northeast is so progressive on issues of race, and we may have been in terms of slavery, but not in terms of equality until much later. Ethnic and racial resentment, the wave of riots in American cities in the 1830s. In fact, many of the early abolitionists were seen as anti-constitutionalists, and they were seen as troublemakers. Even by those that were anti-slavery, they thought the abolition movement went too far. And in fact, a lot of the anti-abolitionists would burn the Constitution as being a racist document for the longest period of time. A lot of tension with the anti-slave activity at that time. But the movement's there, and we know it is at this time. Debates about slavery reflected wider tensions in a changing society. The ultimate question as to whether American democracy had room for people of different races, as well as religion and classes. Some people said yes and struggled to make American society so welcoming to all. But the vast majority, I love this paragraph at the end of chapter 9 because it really clarifies it. Many fought for this equality, but the majority in this era, whether Democrats and Whigs, said no to equality on race, ethnicity, and sex. But, the evolution's slow. It doesn't happen overnight. Have a good, we're on the weekend. Have a good weekend.